On a humid morning in June 1839, at Humen, the narrow throat of the Pearl River where salt wind meets river mud, Lin Zexu stood in his plain official robe and watched the empire do a strange thing. It destroyed wealth. Before him lay trenches lined with stone, behind him soldiers with matchlocks. Around him, clerks, laborers, and local gentry summoned to witness virtue made public. The chests were pried open, their black cakes of opium broken and shoveled into the pits, mixed with lime and brine until the paste went gray and fetid, and then sluiced out toward the sea. From the anchorage, foreign masts punctured the haze, British, American, Parsee, watching as if a marketplace had been overturned. The air carried a medicinal sweetness that did not belong to any honest crop. Lin had asked, with the severe clarity of a magistrate who believes words can still govern men, why a nation that forbade this poison at home insisted on selling it abroad. Now, he answered with an act. If commerce would not be shamed into restraint, it would be compelled into loss. In that moment, the Opium Wars began, not with a cannon shot, but with an administrator's moral arithmetic. To understand how two wars could be fought over a drug, one must begin with the mismatch between two civilizations' expectations. Qing China, immense and inwardly confident, had long treated foreign trade as a regulated nuisance at the margins of a self-sufficient world. The court at Beijing did not imagine itself one sovereign among many. It imagined itself the apex of a moral order under heaven, surrounded by lesser states that approached with tribute, received gifts, and went away satisfied. The Europeans arrived with a different catechism. They came from a continent where competing powers had, for centuries, learned to translate advantage into treaty clauses and treaty clauses into cannon range. They had also acquired a new religion, free trade, which, like older faiths, could sanctify appetite with principle. When these two languages met, misunderstanding was not an accident, but a structure. For Britain, the immediate temptation was tea. By the late 18th century and into the 19th, tea had become a national habit, almost a civic ritual. It soothed factory mornings and punctuated drawing-room evenings. China supplied most of it, and insisted, in the old mercantile manner, on silver in exchange. The flow of specie troubled British officials, who watched bullion leave the realm to pay for leaves, silk, and porcelain. An empire that ruled India and traded on every ocean resented the position of a customer. It wanted, in modern terms, to balance the account. India provided the instrument. In Bengal and elsewhere under British influence, opium poppy could be grown, processed, and sold under a system that made the drug not merely a vice, but a revenue stream. The East India Company, half merchant, half state, presided over production and auction, and private traders carried the product onward. China had long known opium as a medicine. It became a mass intoxicant when smoking methods spread and when foreign supply, cheaper, steadier, and abundant, found the seams of prohibition. Because the Qing state forbade import, the trade matured in the shadow economy. Foreign ships anchored beyond formal jurisdiction. Chinese middlemen ferried chests to the coast. Bribery softened customs. Officials looked away, sometimes from indifference, sometimes from profit, sometimes from despair at an edict impossible to enforce along so long a shoreline. By the 1830s, the scale had grown from an irritant to a crisis. Opium was no longer an exotic indulgence of a few. It seeped into the army, into the bureaucracy, into the villages, into the households of merchants and artisans. The social harm was visible even to those who did not moralize. Men losing work, families selling goods, soldiers neglecting drill, clerks pawning integrity for the means to purchase oblivion. There was also a strategic injury that spoke directly to a fiscally minded dynasty. Silver, which had once flowed into China for tea, began to flow out to pay for opium, In a monetary system where silver underpinned taxes and salaries that drain could become political instability in the slow, lethal way that inflation and corruption become revolt. At court, the debate oscillated between two kinds of realism. Some argued for legalization and taxation. If the drug could not be excluded, perhaps it could be domesticated by state control, as salt had been. Others argued that the state's first duty was moral order, and that to legalize would be to confess impotence. The Emperor Daoguang chose the harder path and appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar official of formidable reputation, to strike at the trade at Canton, Guangzhou, the one legal portal through which most Western commerce was allowed. Canton itself embodied the old system. Foreign merchants were confined to a narrow riverside quarter, their dealings mediated by licensed Chinese merchants, the Kohong, their movement and contact limited, their presence tolerated but not welcomed. Europeans, accustomed to bargaining with sovereigns as equals, experienced these constraints as humiliation. Chinese officials, accustomed to hierarchy, experienced European insistence as insolence. Each side interpreted the other's posture as a moral failure rather than a cultural difference. Lin arrived with the confidence of a man sent not to negotiate but to rectify. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks and sign bonds pledging not to deal in the drug on pain of death. He placed pressure on the Chinese merchants and, when compliance lagged, confined the foreign community in its factories. An improvised siege carried out by bureaucracy and barricade more than by bayonet. After weeks of standoff, the opium was handed over, roughly 20,000 chests, a fortune in narcotic form. Lin's destruction of it at Humen was meant as theater for the empire and as warning to the barbarians. It was also a point of no return. Once property of that magnitude was annihilated under official direction, the question for Britain became whether it would accept the loss as the cost of illicit trade or treat it as an offense against the sanctity of commerce and the dignity of the flag. In London, the argument was dressed in principle and propelled by interest. The traders and their allies insisted that British subjects had been coerced, British property seized, and Britain insulted by a court that refused normal diplomacy. Opponents replied that the property was contraband and that a war to defend a drug would stain the nation. Parliament debated the matter with a seriousness that reveals both the moral unease and the imperial reflex. Even those who disliked the cause often assumed that Britain could not appear weak. The government chose force, and a fleet was sent not merely to avenge merchants, but to compel a new commercial and diplomatic arrangement. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, became, in its military aspect, a lesson in the technological gap between an industrializing maritime power and a traditional continental empire. British steamships could move regardless of wind, their artillery was disciplined and accurate, their logistics were organized for expedition. The Qing forces, brave in pockets and often tragic in their courage, were hampered by poor training, obsolete weapons, and a command structure that had more experience suppressing internal disorder than resisting modern naval bombardment. Coastal forts that looked formidable from the shore were vulnerable from the water. Junks, admirable craft for trade and piracy, could not contend with ships built for gunnery duels. Yet it would be misleading to reduce the war to a simple machine overmatching a man. The deeper asymmetry lay in aims. Britain's objectives were limited and negotiable: ports, tariffs, indemnity, and status. China's objective, at least as conceived by the court, was to restore a moral and administrative order that did not admit bargaining with coercion. When one side seeks specific concessions and the other seeks the re-establishment of cosmic propriety, compromise becomes not merely difficult but conceptually indecent. The British campaign moved along the coast like a demonstration of capability, taking positions, threatening cities, and forcing officials to negotiate under pressure. There were preliminary arrangements and repudiations, scapegoats and sudden promotions, each reflecting the court's tendency to treat foreign crises as local failures of administrators rather than as systemic challenges. Hong Kong, a rocky island with a deep harbor, entered the story as a practical pawn, a place for British ships to anchor and merchants to operate without Chinese permission. In 1842, after the British pushed up the Yangtze and captured strategic points that endangered the grain supply and the prestige of the dynasty, the Qing court accepted what it had tried to avoid, a treaty made under duress. The Treaty of Nanjing, 1842, was not in itself a comprehensive blueprint for empire. It was a door forced open. It required an indemnity, the cession of Hong Kong, and the opening of several ports: Canton, Xiamen, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, where British merchants could trade under defined rules. Subsequent agreements added what later became the true architecture of the treaty system: fixed tariffs that limited China's control over its own customs, most favored nation clauses that ensured any concession granted to one power would spread to others, and extraterritorial provisions that removed foreigners from Chinese legal jurisdiction. These were legal devices, but their psychological effect was imperial. A civilization that had long assumed its law to be universal now had, within its own cities, enclaves where its officials could not punish, and where foreigners lived as if inside a portable Britain. The opium trade, meanwhile, did not disappear. The First War had been sparked by opium, but the settlement did not solve the opium question. It solved the question of access and leverage. Merchants continued to bring the drug. Chinese consumers continued to buy it. Officials continued to oscillate between suppression and complicity. The treaty ports enlarged legitimate commerce: textiles, machinery, tea, and all the miscellany of an industrial age. But they also entrenched the logic that force could rewrite China's boundaries. If the First War was a breach, it was also a precedent. China's predicament after 1842 was worsened by the timing of history. The mid-19th century brought internal convulsions that would have tested even a robust state. The Taiping Rebellion rose in the south and swept across provinces, establishing rival authority and costing millions of lives. Other uprisings flared. Fiscal systems strained. Local gentry armed militias. The center's grasp loosened. In such a landscape, foreign demands, which might have been managed by a confident dynasty, became humiliations layered on exhaustion. For Western powers, however, China's weakness looked like opportunity. They wanted more ports, access to the interior, permission to station diplomats in Beijing, and a revision of treaties they considered still too restrictive. They also wanted their commerce dignified by legality. Opium, that profitable embarrassment, was better defended when it could be treated as simply another commodity. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, sometimes called the Arrow War, began with one of those incidents that seem small until they meet a powder magazine. At Canton, Chinese officials boarded the Arrow, a vessel associated, through registration and paperwork, with Britain, and arrested its Chinese crew on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. Britain claimed that its flag had been insulted and its rights violated. China replied that the ship was Chinese and that paperwork was being used as a cloak. Almost at once, another grievance joined the first: the killing of a French missionary in the interior, which France treated as both a religious offense and a diplomatic lever. Britain and France, now allied in the enterprise, set about compelling treaty revision by force. The campaign revealed a grim refinement of the method used before: seize a port, impose demands, and when resistance stiffens, move closer to the political heart. Canton was bombarded and occupied. Its commissioner, Ye Mingchen, became a symbol, admired by some for defiance, blamed by others for inflexibility, of a bureaucratic courage that could not translate into military success. The Anglo-French forces then attacked the forts at the mouth of the Hai River near Tianjin, the Taku forts, opening a route toward Beijing. Under the pressure, the Qing agreed in 1858 to the treaties of Tianjin, which promised foreign legations in the capital, more open ports, greater travel rights for foreigners, and expanded privileges for missionaries and trade. But treaties signed under threat still require ratification, and here the old Chinese instinct to delay, reinterpret, and contain, so effective in managing tributary relations, met the West's insistence on literal enforcement. When Allied envoys tried to proceed to Beijing in 1859 to exchange ratifications, they encountered renewed resistance at the forts and were repelled in a battle that briefly lifted Chinese morale. The respite was short. In 1860, a larger expedition returned, took the forts, advanced inland, and reached the outskirts of Beijing. What followed belongs to the moral ledger of empire. During negotiations and skirmishes, some Allied prisoners were tortured and killed, acts of cruelty that, in the heat of retaliation and the rhetoric of punishment, became justification for a spectacle of destruction. Lord Elgin, leading the British mission, ordered the burning of the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace, an architectural treasury of pavilions, gardens, libraries, and art. The act was intended as a lesson. Strike not merely at troops, but at symbols. Teach a court that dignity has a price. It succeeded as humiliation and failed as wisdom. The palace burned, looting spread, and a memory was planted that would outlast the treaties, that the foreigner, preaching civilization, could behave like a vandal when interest and anger aligned. The Convention of Beijing, 1860, ratified the Tianjin terms and added new concessions, including additional territory adjacent to Hong Kong and the deepening of foreign privileges. In the same period, Russia, with a cooler diplomacy and without firing many shots, secured large territorial gains in the Amur and Ussuri regions by exploiting China's distraction, an example of how weakness invites not only assault but bargain. By 1860, the opium in Opium Wars had become both literal and symbolic. Opium remained a profitable trade and a corrosive habit. The treaties helped make its movement harder to oppose and easier to normalize. But the wars were also about the redefinition of sovereignty. China was compelled to accept permanent foreign presence, foreign diplomacy at its center, and foreign law within its borders. The old idea that the empire could regulate contact as a favor was replaced by a new reality. Contact would be regulated by international agreements backed by force, and the West would decide when the agreements were sufficient. It is tempting, especially in hindsight, to cast the Qing as merely victim and the West as merely predator. History, however, is rarely so tidy. The British state did not march to war purely because merchants were greedy. It marched because a commercial society had learned to treat markets as lifelines, because its political class believed power must secure trade routes, and because it had come to think of its own norms, contract, flag, access, as universal. Nor was the Qing state simply innocent. It was rigid in diplomacy, complacent in defense, and often corrupt in administration. It could denounce the drug and yet permit the bribe. It could invoke morality and yet fail to reform the conditions that made addiction and smuggling widespread. Still, when one weighs the equities, one cannot avoid the central fact. A modern state used military force to protect and expand a commerce that included a narcotic whose social consequences were known, and it imposed, as the price of peace, a legal system of inequality. The longer consequence was not only economic, but psychological. The treaty ports became conduits for goods and missionaries, for engineers and soldiers, for modern weapons and modern ideas. Shanghai grew into a hybrid city where Chinese wealth and foreign capital met under unequal terms. Chinese reformers, staring at defeat, began to ask why the Middle Kingdom had been humbled and what strength now meant, whether it was ships, factories, schools, or constitutions. The dynasty itself entered a long era of self-strengthening efforts and half-reforms, perpetually late, perpetually compromised by faction and fear. The wars did not alone topple the Qing, but they helped unseat its myth of invulnerability. And once a state loses the aura of inevitability, every crisis thereafter becomes harder to manage. In a narrower sense, the Opium Wars were episodes in the 19th century's wider movement, the extension of European power into Asia by a combination of commerce, diplomacy, and coercion. In a deeper sense, they were collisions between two moral economies, one rooted in the Confucian ambition to govern desire by order, the other rooted in the liberal capitalist ambition to liberate trade even when it trafficked in the darker appetites of mankind. The cold wind that blew over Humen in Lin Zexu's imagination was the wind of moral law. The wind that filled British sails was the wind of profit, sanctified as principle. Between them lay a people who would smoke, suffer, adapt, resist, and, in time, remember. And history, which is never content with one cause, would fold that memory into the long, complicated making of modern China.